Years ago, I was serving a church that was celebrating a major anniversary. We sent out invitations to former pastors. We planned a special worship service and a fabulous dinner to celebrate all of those years of faithful service in the community. One of the longtime members with a penchant for history combed through meeting minutes, decades worth of meeting minutes and newsletters to write a history catch-up, outlining everything that had been going on for the 25 years since the last major university we had celebrated. He selected a few key people in the congregation to proofread it before printing multiple copies. Well, some of those proofreaders were not so happy to read what he had written. He had written the truth as he had read it. Everything that had been going on in that congregation, and the response was, "You can't include that. It doesn't make us look good." History, at least true, complete history, does not always make us look good. Even those of us who have lived our entire lives trying to be as good as we possibly could be, have those little embarrassments in our past, things that we hope nobody will ever hear about. I still remember hiding a test in the closet, not wanting my parents to see the grade. It's not so different for groups of people than it is for individuals, churches, communities, entire religious denominations, nations. Don't include that. It doesn't make us look good. People will get the wrong idea about us. People will think we're not good people if you include that piece. So you have to ask how much of the history taught to us was edited to make the ancestors who had the privilege to write the story look good. The story I remember learning was that Christopher Columbus found this wonderful land in 1492 that nobody had ever found before. And nothing much happened here until 1620 when the Pilgrims came and built this barely inhabited place into a nation. Now I'm sure that if I had some classes that concentrated on a specific history, my story would be a little bit more nuanced than that. But I think, if we're honest, that's about the story that most of us got in our schooling. As the world gets smaller and we are all connected to one another, as original documents are digitized, dug out of that trunk where they've been hiding, published and accessible by people around the world, and as those who write history are finally taking seriously the voices of Native people who were silenced for far too long, we are learning that the neat, tidy histories that we were taught as children were limited at best, and most likely intentionally deceptive. How do we right that wrong at this point in our history? How do we expand the story for people whose very identity is built around this notion that their people were the heroes in the story? Listen again to these words from Paul. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Jim Baer said, the first step is truth-telling. As long as we continue to hold up this mythologized story, as long as we continue to tell the story as if it's an old Western with easily defined heroes and villains, we will continue to treat the descendants as either heroes or villains. As long as we tell the story from only one perspective, we will continue to believe that one set of ancestors were blameless. It's a little tricky to mention, but I have seen another phenomenon come forward in our effort to expand this story, because I've seen a small group of people who just try to flip the myth, right? Try to villainize all white people and romanticize the life and culture of all Native peoples. Now, don't get me wrong. Seeing the beauty of Native culture, understanding just how much wisdom from the Native perspective our nation has lost throughout time because we've only told the white story is huge. And getting rid of that attitude, learning that wisdom, appreciating that wisdom is vital to the healing process. But mythologizing another perspective does not make history. It just makes new mythology. It still leaves us in that place where we just have to define who is the hero and who is the villain. It still leaves us with a society where some people must be shamed and diminished in order for others to take places of pride and honor. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, "The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." And from another text, he said, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." It is this world, this Jesus vision of community for which I long. This ability to understand that within each and every one of us lives both saint and sinner. I long for a letting down of the guard and acknowledging that each and every one of us is born human, limited in our vision and easily led into places of fear and hatred and violence when we feel threatened. To pretend that only our people are incapable of hatred and violence gets in the way of the truth-telling. And without truth-telling, there can be no healing. For when we acknowledge that any one of us could be led to that place of fear and violence, we can stop looking at violence itself as the core of the problem, because violence itself is not the core of the problem. So when we acknowledge that we too could get violent, we can start to see it as the symptom that it is. A symptom of injustice, a symptom of not being heard, a symptom of a threat to life. a symptom of a threat to our self-worth. I long for the world where we remember just how often Jesus lifted people from places of shame and reminded them that each and every one of us has the capacity for greatness. Each and every one of us is born with that spark of the divine within, created in the image and the likeness of God. Imagine the healing that could take place if we started with that understanding of humanity. Imagine the healing if we could look past the anger and violence and recognize instead the fear and the pain. Imagine the world when we join all of those divine sparks and impulses for love into one. Imagine, little by little, our fears that someone might think less of us would simply fade away. And we could tell the whole story of who we are and who we have been, simply giving thanks for God's leading and for God's helping us to evolve into more loving communities, more loving nations, and a more loving world. As we move into this month of expanding our understanding of the complicated relationship between the indigenous people of this continent and the Europeans who arrived more than 400 years ago, may we remember our own capacity for hurt and our own capacity for healing. May we hold in our hearts the pain of learning the hurt our ancestors experienced and the hurt that our ancestors caused for just a moment, and then release it to God's care so that we can hear openly and honestly a fuller story of our past. May we begin to recognize and to honor the Imago Dei, the image of God in one another, in all the ancestors, and in all peoples of the world. Amen.